Hi, everybody. Good evening and welcome to our September Egalitarian Guest of the Month. Tonight, I have with me Dr. Chanequa Walker-Barnes, who is a Christian psychologist, ordained minister, as well as the author of Too Heavy a Yoke, Black Women and the Burden of Strength. Dr. Chanequa, do you want to say hi to people before I...
Hi. Yeah, hi everybody. I'm here in Atlanta and I'm wishing everybody a good evening if it's evening where you are.
Okay, so I'm going to do a little introduction of Dr. Chanequa before we go into our question and answer time and learn from her. Dr. Walker-Barnes is a clinical psychologist, a public theologian, and minister whose work integrates healing, justice, and reconciliation. With earned degrees from Emory University, the University of Miami, and Duke University, she utilizes her interdisciplinary background to write, speak, and teach about self-care, racial and gender justice, and reconciliation. She's also the author of Too Heavy a Yoke, Black Women and the Burden of Strength, which examines the role of gendered racism on the development of the myth of the strong Black woman and its impact upon the health and well-being of African American women. She is currently working on or has finished, Dr. Walker.
Yeah,
She
just
just
finished.
finished her second book, Disrupting Racial Reconciliation. She serves as the Associate Professor of Practical Theology at the Mercer University McAfee School of Theology and is licensed to practice psychology in Georgia. Dr. Chanequa is an ecumenical minister whose faith has been shaped by Methodist, Baptist, and evangelical social justice communities. She was ordained by an independent fellowship that holds incarnational theology, community engagement, social justice, and prophetic witness at its core values. So welcome, Dr.
Thank you.
We are really, truly honored to have you here tonight. Oh my gosh, all this accomplishment. I doff my hat to you.
Oh, well, I'm glad for this conversation.
Thank you. So we are going to get started, and we're going to get started by asking you if you could just please tell us and the viewers a little bit about yourself,
Okay.
your country of origin or state of origin, tell us about your family, your current profession, academic track. We already said a little bit of that.
Yeah.
Whatever is not in the bio,
Yeah, I'll fill in some gaps. I am originally from Atlanta. That's where I was born and raised. And that's where I live now. I've spent my entire life in the southeast of the U.S., between Florida, North Carolina, Tennessee, Georgia, Alabama. So my roots are here. And so I've been back in Atlanta now for about 6 years. I had been away for about 18 years, kind of bouncing around some of those other places. My clan, kind of the people I spend my life with on a daily basis are my husband. We just celebrated 21 years about a month ago. Yeah, and we have a 10-year-old son, and my mom lives with us, and then we have a little dog. And just I have lots of extended family in the area. And so I'm always trying to balance work and family. That's something they don't teach you how to do in graduate school. Especially when it's an extended family. So doing that. And I teach at the McAfee School of Theology at Mercer University, which is actually just a couple of miles away from where I live. So yeah.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, so how would you describe yourself? So would you describe yourself as a complementarian, an egalitarian, a feminist, a womanist? Whatever term you pick, what does it mean to you, and why would you describe yourself that way?
Yeah, my primary identity is as a womanist. And that's particularly because I'm in theology and teaching and working in theology. That tends to be my primary identity.
Okay.
It's the lens through which I do my work.
Mm-hmm.
I also identify as a feminist, especially when I'm doing work outside of theology,
Okay.
where the term feminism is often used more than womanism. And then I am probably a radical egalitarian, and my own relationship has been built on egalitarian principles.
Mhm.
Yeah, so that's how I would um, I would identify. Matter of fact, until probably recently, because I'm on sabbatical, I'm cooking. My son at one point, I remember him saying, "It's mostly dads who do all the cooking, right?"
What a
And I
change.
was like, "Absolutely, that's exactly right." But yes, we have been working our way through trying to figure out what it means to live in an egalitarian relationship, especially when you don't have models for that in
Yes.
your family. Um, so we have been, we've kind of stumbled our way through, and I think we've kind of gotten to a place where we're really comfortable with where we are and who we are. But it's been a long time and long process.
You know what, Dr. Chanequa, that raises two questions for me. Like, first
Yeah.
of all, I heard you, and this is the first time we've had a guest who did this, who identified as a feminist, a womanist, and an egalitarian.
Yeah.
What do you see as differences between these three um, terms?
Yeah, there's some overlap, right? And womanism, so feminism, if we think about kind of feminism as the fight, the struggle for women's equality in kind of all aspects of life, right?
Okay.
And that's kind of been the overarching umbrella, I think, that has held together a lot of women's concerns. But
Mhm.
feminism has branches, it has protest movements, and womanism really arose as kind of as a counter to feminism, and specifically to some of the shortcomings that Black women were experiencing within the feminist movement, and the failure of the feminist movement, especially second wave feminism, so up and through like the 70s, 80s, that feminists were not really willing or able to address issues of race, right? And womanists were at this intersection between race and gender, where they felt that their needs, the needs of Black women, were not fully being addressed by either the civil rights movement, which was very race first, or the feminist movement, which was very gender first. And so Alice Walker actually coined the term womanism, and has a definition for it in the book In Search of Our Mother's Gardens. Um, and, and and there are a few things that are different, I think. Womanism, for one, centers on the perspectives of Black women, and especially in the Americas, not limited to the Americas. And there are some other feminisms, third world feminisms that are related to, spring out of Sisters to Womanism. But it offers a broader view in that it begins with the perspective of Black women, but then it looks at that as a grounding point from which to reach out, right? And so womanists are, we talk about that we are concerned with the survivals of whole people, male and female.
Yes.
Because we understand that what is good for Black women is also going to be what is good for Black men, what is good for children, what is good for men and women, and genderqueer people of a variety of races, right? And so that kind of communal focus, I think, is one of the reasons that the term womanism has been so important to Black women in theology. And feminism, I should say, has in some ways responded to the challenges that womanists levied. Womanists like Alice Walker, Bell Hooks, they have responded. And so feminism has come a long way as well. And so I'm comfortable calling myself a feminist, especially a Black feminist in the tradition of Bell Hooks and Audre Lorde, as well as Womanist.
Wow.
Yeah.
So that is I that's something you said in there that struck me, because I have not been, prior to today, I've not been able to fit myself squarely in one box other than egalitarianism. But when I hear you talk about the womanist concept, I'm saying like that's who I am, you know, because
Yeah.
I have this conviction that for Black folks, we cannot talk about equality for women without talking about equality for our men,
Right.
or our children. So in a way, hey, I just realized. Thank you for helping me see that, Dr.
Yeah. No problem.
Yeah. Okay. So let's talk about your book, To Heavy a Yoke, Black Women and the Burden of Strength.
Yeah.
Woo! If you haven't gotten a hold of this book, you should pick it up. It will change your life. And I think it is helpful for all women, but especially women of color. You really did a good job of really getting to the heart of the issues really, really quickly. I really appreciate that. It was hard to put it down. I have it marked all over the place. Yeah, so let's talk a little bit about your book. Can you give us, first of all, the story behind the book?
Yeah. You want the short story or the long story?
Go
I'll try
for
to
it,
do it.
Dr. Walker. We don't have you every day. Go with the long one. Come on, people. You say
Yeah.
you heard it
So
first on cbe-voc.
yeah, I'll tell a little bit of the story that's in the book, but I'll also tell the part that's not in the book, right?
Okay.
So this really started out of my own experience. As I talk about in the book quite openly, I am a strong Black woman in recovery. I am the child and the grandchild and the niece and the daughter-in-law and of so many strong Black women.
Mm-hmm.
That this is something I found myself really struggling against, and really reached a point, and I talk about it in my life. I talk about it in the book. I reached a real discrete point at which I kind of woke up and realized that I had just turned 30 and I was having a lot of stress-related health problems. They were clearly stress-related, and they were problems I was really too young to be having as someone at the age of 30, chronic pain, hypertension, all sorts of other things. And I realized that so many of my struggles, both physical and emotional, had to do with trying to be everything to everyone all the time, and the degree to which, while I was doing that, I was also bottling that up. And so I talk about that in the book. But part of what happened was that I began my own process of self-healing, which is actually quite this book, this project is very tied into my call to ministry. I was at the time working in clinical psychology as a psychology faculty member. I had not gone to seminary. And I began working on my own healing and really putting some things in place, began to experience a turnaround. And one day at the end of my prayer meditation, just kind of thinking, sitting in place and thinking, wow, God, if this stuff has worked for me, maybe it can work for other women. And I heard God's voice saying, yes, it can, right? And I always tell people, as a psychologist, you have to kind of test yourself out. Was that voice from inside my head? Was it from outside my head? Like, what was that? What was that about? And I was like, no, that was not a hallucination. That was the voice of God. And so I began actually running, just like, no, God, I'm a clinical psychologist, tenure track position. This is my life. This is what I'm doing. But kind of long story short, ended up developing initially a what was supposed to be a 6-week study group for my church, for the women's group at my church. Wrote a little workbook. The 6 weeks turned into 2 years.
Wow.
Within that 6 weeks, I realized that I was called to ministry, and that was kind of small voice I'd been hearing for years, and so ended up leaving my position and going to seminary. Wow. Kept struggling with this. Wrote presented at a few conferences, kept thinking this was over, that, okay, I've presented at this conference, and then people said, well, no, you have to write it up. I did a regional conference, and then I did my first presentation at the American Academy of Religion, and people were very supportive. I was a seminary student at this time, but so people said, you have to write it up. So I wrote an article, and really, again, thought, this is it. Everybody knows this. I don't need to do anything else with this. But really kept being pressed by other people. And it was even a friend of mine in seminary who said, this doesn't sound like an article. It sounds like a book.
Wow.
And this was a white male friend who I was talking to him one day. He said, yeah, this sounds like a book. And I thought, oh. And so, so that's how the book came about.
Wow, that's a beautiful thing to behold when God just surprises you with your journey. Yeah. So I would love us to explore a few themes in your book tonight. There are really lots of meaty material to go through. I had to restrain myself to a few because I was filling up the page. It's like, oh my gosh, we do not have enough time.
Wow.
But what I'm going to start with is something that I think really captures the essence of this book and the message you are trying to bring out to people is your use and reference and definition and analysis of this term strong Black woman together.
Yeah.
Versus strong, separate words, Black woman. Could you talk a little bit about that? Just help people understand what you mean by almost like a hashtag strong Black woman.
Yeah. So I'm really drawing on work that had been done before by Joan Morgan, who wrote a book with the title When Chicken Heads Come Home to Roost, probably about 10 years before mine, in which she began to talk about the strong Black woman and smushing them together. And then also Mark Anthony Neal, who's a professor at Duke in North Carolina, who's written a book about strong Black men. It also kind of does that smushing it together. The reason I wanted to do that was because I wanted people to be clear that when I talk about the strong Black woman, I'm not talking about someone who's strong, Black, and a woman, right? It's okay to be all of those things. But I'm really talking about a specific way of being in a world, a way that women of African descent, and it's not simply women in the U.S., it is, I've run across the same thing, women throughout the African diaspora. This very particular way of being in the world that is centered around the kind of 3 core characteristics of emotional strength, caregiving, and independence, right? And that this idea that we must be all these things, that we don't have a choice in being all these things, and that a failure to be all of these things is a failure of our duty as women, a failure of our duty as Christians, right? It's tied up with so much of our cultural and religious beliefs that if we feel like we can't be all of these, we feel like we are not appropriately Black women.
Yeah. So I resonate with that a lot. Now, one of the things you talk about in your book is you actually trace the history for African American women.
Yeah.
And I when I read it, I saw how true it was, and just like what you said right now, in a way, it just wasn't applicable only to African American women. However, it is the history of why this is very much of an issue for Black women in the States, and I'm assuming other women of color. But let's focus on the one you focused on, the African American women. Can you tell just a little bit, because I know it's going to pop up again in all the other things. Can you help give people a little bit of a history of your synthesis of the strong Black woman from the perspective of an African-American woman and how it developed? I could possibly say, because it's all over me, but I'd love for people to hear it from you if you don't mind.
Yeah. And it really is this kind of combination of the experience of slavery or colonialism and patriarchy is where the strong Black woman comes from. And so in the early part of the 20th century, late 19th century, early 20th century, there was a movement called the Club Women's Movement. White women in the U.S. they were all these women's clubs, and Black women as well. So Black women had Black women's clubs movements. These clubs would meet in churches for the most part, and they were engaged in kind of the work of teaching people how to be good homemakers, but also how to be, for Black women, good citizens, right? And good leaders out in the public sphere. And part of their work was actually trying to combat the negative stereotypes that proliferated about Black women, especially in white media. And there was this one particular article that really put the Black Women's Club movement into high gear, where a white newspaper man basically characterized all Black women as prostitutes, thieves, and liars, right? And Black women kind of galvanized around that and developed this alternative image, which is the strong Black woman. And basically with this, they were saying, we are moral, we are pure, we are domestic kind of goddesses in the same way that white women are. But they also said, but we're more than that. We also have the qualities of leadership, the capacity to care for our communities, and to be leaders for our community in the same way that Black men do. And they actually went out and very systematically spread the message of what it meant to be a strong Black woman. They went into churches and they held classes. They would go into homes and teach women and girls how to carry themselves, how to have the kind of composure of a strong Black woman. They began to write about this all the time. And over time, then the image began to actually, it worked. It began to, in many ways, overtake these negative stereotypes. People might remember a period back to the 70s and 80s. If you watch TV, the most prevalent roles of Black women on TV in the US would be the welfare queen, right? The prostitute, the bad Black mother, right? And then in the 90s, especially in 2000, so we begin to see a shift. And now at this point, almost every character, we're starting to see another shift now. But up until about 2 years ago, when Insecure came out, almost every single character of Black women on TV and also film was a strong Black woman, right? They were the Miranda Edwards from Grey's Anatomy. They were Olivia Pope, right? They were Claire Huxtable. We were seeing this over and over again to this was the dominant. There was basically one role that all Black actresses were playing, right? And so it's only recently that we've begun to see people show these more fleshed out characters that are more than just kind of taking care of everybody else.
Yeah. You know, one of the things I had never seen How to Get Away with Murder, but it was so funny. While I was getting ready for this interview, I did a marathon viewing of it.
Okay.
And I was like, wait a minute, this woman is what Dr. Walker is talking about in her book. Because you talk about in your book some characteristics of the strong Black woman is she is taking care of everybody, and she is not allowed to show vulnerability, because to be vulnerable, to be visibly vulnerable, publicly vulnerable, is to kind of perpetuate the stigma from the old days that we're weak, and we need to show that we're strong. And so to our own detriment, we don't want to show any cracks, right? Black crack.
Right.
So we're going to stay through everything. But what you're saying is that really we are cracking, even though we're not showing it. And I saw it in the show. I was like, wait a minute, this woman is cracking up. But she could not. Whenever her friend would reach out to her, she would push her away. You know, she didn't want to sing. She couldn't take help, but she's solving everybody's problems. She's a fixer. And there was something else that stood out to me, which you also put in your book, how she was bearing, the strong Black woman bears the weight of her racist failures.
Mm-hmm.
So here is a woman, everybody blames her when things go wrong. When things are right, she's the one who fixes it. And then they get mad at her for any little slide, and then when things go wrong, everybody comes back, cries back to her. So here she is. People don't accept their faults. Mm-hmm. She carries their faults for them. She keeps on loving. She keeps on giving. I have to say that this was a real depiction of what I have experienced myself as a Nigerian American in the U.S. for the past 20 years, and just watching other Black women carry the same burdens. We want to show our people strong. Yeah. We don't want people to diss us, so we're going to do everything to protect that name. Yeah, thank you so much for shedding clarity on that. Another theme I want to touch on here is you talked about the racialized African American women identities, in which you address like the Jezebel, the Mammy, and the Matriarch as ways of helping us move through the cycle of how we came up with this identity, what it is we're moving away from. And the effect of the racialized African American women identities on the desirability or lack of desirability to African American males.
Yeah.
So one of the things that I see, which that addresses, is how at the end of the day, despite trying to lift our race up, including men and women, mm-hmm. Black women get left behind by their men.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. Wow. We're getting into real deep conversation here. So the consequence of this, the way in which Black women do this is, well, for one, there's a whole lot of health issues. But there's also a lot of relational barriers, right? Mm-hmm. So part of the problem in the U.S. and I think globally is that the standard of white femininity is still the kind of hegemonic ideal about what it means to be a woman, right? And it really is this kind of frozen in time perspective of femininity and what we used to call the cult of true womanhood. That was kind of this 18th century model of a woman who was pious and pure and submissive and domesticated, right? And so still today, kind of the ideal mate for a man, and many churches spread this gospel, is somebody who has those characteristics, right? But then Black women, because of our history in this country, we were never allowed to have those characteristics in the popular imagination, right? Mm-hmm. And we were never seen as being the embodiment of those characteristics. So if your ideal is a woman who is going to be weak and submissive, yeah. But Black women have had to evolve into these strong figures, right? Yeah. To take care of communities, to take care of churches, to take care of all these places we are to take care of. We don't have that permission to be weak, to be submissive. But if men have been conditioned to expect a certain type of partner, mm-hmm. Then they don't see that. They see the strong Black woman, or Black women in general, as the antithesis of that, right? Their ideal partner. And so the idea of these internalized messages about race and gender and the way they affect all of us, right?
Yeah.
They affect hair, right, and our preferences for
Mm-hmm.
hair. They affect colorism,
Mm-hmm.
and men's and there's all kinds of data out there showing that light-skinned women across country, across race, they marry higher status men, they have better salaries, they have more occupational prestige, and this is after you control for everything else, right?
Yeah.
And when beauty is racialized, and the ideal is the white woman with blonde hair, blue eyes, women of African descent, women across the board are rated in how close they are to the ideal. And women of African descent are going to be the furthest away from that ideal. And so that these stereotypes then begin to impact our relationships in terms of desirability within the race.
Wow, that is truly deep. Have you formulated any, because you didn't speak about that in the book, but I wondered, with how well you analyzed that and knowing it to be true from experience, um, do you have any suggestions for our men how to guard against that?
Yeah, I don't know if there's any way you guard against it because so many of these messages start at such a young age. I mean, like I said, I have a 10-year-old son, and I'm constantly conscious of the messages he's getting about who is beautiful, right? Through television, through everything, who is beautiful.
Mm-hmm.
He recently, for a school project, said Cardi B was his favorite artist. And on the first hand, I was like, why are you listening? Like, when did you hear Cardi B? And you shouldn't be listening to that. But on the other hand, I was like, yes, a brown woman.
We should start a fan club. One of my
Right.
favorite, yeah, one of my
Right.
favorite youth in my church loves Cardi B too. I was like, huh?
Yes. Right. And so there's that. So those messages, they come early, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it's not so much that we can guard against them, but we have to do the work of decolonizing ourselves, right? That's part of the work that white supremacy does, is it makes all of us think that whiteness is superior.
Yeah.
And I think Black women, we have been dealing with that in our own ways. The natural hair movement is one way that we have been trying to separate from that, right? But you also have Black men, I think, have to do the same amount of work to decolonize themselves, especially as it relates to their images of beauty.
That is neat. Thank you, Dr. Walker. So I will move on to my next theme, which I isolated to talk about as one of the things that really stood out to me was how you talked about the church also being one of the spaces that is responsible for developing this culture of the strong Black woman in the messages that are preached to women of color, in the expectations that are ahead of women of color. So there's the constant. I remember the story you told of the woman who was sick, had just come out of surgery or something, and here she goes to church and they're delivering her with demands, and nobody stopped to think, wow, what are you doing here?
Right.
You know, can you go home? Let's go take a break. But you're so strong. You're so this, and you know, I want to, for people who haven't read the book, I want to talk a little bit about that because I don't think people realize that this is a book for pastors. Also, it was very helpful to me to call my attention to how I respond to women of color, especially African American women, paying attention. Can you do just a little bit of the servitude rather than servanthood message that the church pushes on women, and
Yeah.
how this is detrimental to our whole understanding of self, and our identity, and
Yeah.
yeah.
So one of the most common um, ideas that we draw upon to talk about discipleship and the kind of the path for discipleship is the idea of picking up the cross, right?
Yeah.
Suffering as Jesus suffered,
Yeah.
serving others, right?
Mhm.
And letting go of pride. And this notion, and there's this long history in theology of people thinking about the fundamental human sin is that of pride, right? And we all have to guard against our pride. And part of what we need to do is we need to humble ourselves through service.
Yeah.
And Reinhold Niebuhr was one that really pushed this idea, saying this. And there was another theologian, a feminist theologian, Valerie Saving, who came back and said, maybe for men, the fundamental sin is pride, and this idea of having an inflated sense of self. But for women, it more often than not is a lack of self, right?
Yeah.
It is this idea of not even having a sense of self. And actually, we're conditioned from girlhood on to serve others. And so then to kind of beat women over the head with another message of service, right? It basically says some of us become servants of servants. And then when you add the layers of race on that, it becomes even worse than that. And so this idea that we have of that service and servanthood and having a servant mentality, these are good things, but they cannot be separated from other messages in the gospel that actually talk about kind of uplifting the marginalized, right? But because we have tended to always read the gospel through the lens of the privilege, then we tell everybody that what they need to do then is to humble themselves, right? Because that's what the privileged need to do. So, men, especially in power, need to humble themselves. Well, for women, it may be that you need to find your sense of self, right, to begin with. So you need to be lifted up,
Yes.
As opposed to being pressed down, right, and to find your voice. And so this becomes a way in which already in the church, because we have these messages about gender and how women are supposed to serve about gender, and then on top of that, and also because, what Christ wants you to do is to serve. And the way that women often take this, especially in places that don't ordain women, in congregations that, or may ordain women, but kind of leave them in a limited role.
Yes.
Is what often is women are trapped in this endless cycle of servitude, that in some cases borders on abuse, or in some cases is flat out abusive of their gifts, right? And won't actually live into their gifts out of this sense of, I need to pull back, right? And so we tend to suppress our gifts. We put our light under a bushel as women because we're told that anything else is actually not good discipleship. And so with Strong Black Woman hear that message at multiple levels. It's not just the gender level, but it is that racialized gender level as well. And churches really benefit from the kind of the labor, the extra labor that Black women often feel that they have to do to kind of merit their position in the kingdom, right? To merit their position in the church, right? This way in which churches, particularly churches with African American women, benefit a lot from the free labor, the underpaid labor that women do. I see this all the time as a seminary faculty, and many of my other colleagues talk about the challenges of African American women in seminary. Who often work for churches for free, but they're doing so much work, it should be a paid job, right? And that it actually interferes with their ability to prepare for ministry and to focus on their seminary work because they're doing so much other kind of free labor. And so that is a issue that we see all the time in churches, and that churches, I think, Some unknowingly, but I think some knowingly take advantage of.
Hmm. Yeah, that is definitely true. One of the things that I marked to myself was how this message of servitude and humbling yourself, how women we receive it, especially if you have pastors who are critical of women
Yeah.
and put down women, and so every woman is trying to be holy by subduing herself and working the hardest, and it provides a lot of free labor, and to me it just seemed like how it's like punishment. It's like saying you're not worthy, so we make you
Yeah.
our servants. And as a matter of fact, I don't know if you did this comparison, I don't remember, but I remember taking down notes and saying servitude, I think you did, I think you said it, that the servitude is different from servanthood.
Yeah.
And God calls us to servanthood, which we're to mutually serve one another.
Yeah.
But what the church has unpacked on women is servitude. And
Yes.
one of the things that I was conscious about, that's really odd that even in this same context, preaching the same message to people, it's easy to hear men refer to themselves as servant leaders without doing half of what the women are doing.
Right.
So, so you're the servant leader, but the woman is still serving you.
Right.
And she's still waiting on you, back and call, and she's still the one who does the menial things. And you're still the boss. And yeah, that was very helpful. So to transition from the book to the back to our questions, I want to just talk about the clinical and pastoral aspects of your book, which is really really helpful, as you were giving recommendations for both clinicians, psychologists, and pastors on how to woo women out of, with African American women out of this space, to help them to be whole.
Yeah.
And before you go into that, I just want to say to anybody listening that you really need to pick up this book, because it does a good expose of the things that the strong Black woman undergoes that nobody knows about. You know, I think about the mental issues, the mental stress, having no one that you can actually be openly vulnerable with, because if you do, you have failed. And I just think about how even people don't respond too well to the strong Black woman showing any signs of vulnerability.
Yeah.
And I think how unhealthy. And one of the things I liked when you were giving recommendations to the pastor, to the clinicians, was just creating space for the women to be vulnerable, letting them just be. So can you talk a little bit about that across the three professions that care, at least for our bodies and souls?
Yeah. Part of it is for people to really educate themselves to know what this is,
Mm-hmm.
so that they can identify it when they see it, right? And so that they know to go beneath the surface. So much of the book comes out of my experience as a clinician who was working with primarily Black women who were considered strong Black women, right? Who would go out into their workplaces, their families, their churches, and people would praise them about how much they had it together, how perfect their lives were, how wonderful they were. And they were in my office every week falling apart. Women who were in therapy and didn't even want their husbands to know that they were in therapy, right? That it was such a big deal to be seen as having needs, right? Women who talked about not that their husbands had never seen them cry, right? That's some serious stuff. If you talk about kind of the lack of vulnerability. And so the one thing I want people to do is to recognize that very often what they're seeing with strong Black women is a mask, right? And that there's often much more going on beneath the mask, that where the mask may seem, the outer person may seem calm and collected and kind of unbothered by everything that's going on, internally, there may be a lot more happening. It may not even be at the level of the person's awareness in terms of their emotions, because so many strong Black women, we've become so good at stuffing our feelings down. We don't even know they're there. Like our bodies know. Right? Our bodies tell the stories that we can't tell, right? So we're suffering, we're having problems with blood pressure. Something like 50% of Black women have high blood pressure by the age of 20. That's a serious crisis, right? That we're not talking about. Diabetes, high death rates. And so it's for people to recognize that. The other thing is people have to be very, caregivers, whether it's a therapist, a pastor, have to interrogate our own relationship to strong Black women and the way in which we need the strength of strong Black women, right? There's a way in which we can often not want people to get out of that role because they do something for us, right? And so we will, and I've had people talk about even their therapists, right, who praise their strength. And they were thinking, I mean, my therapist is the person I'm supposed to be able to go to and just let everything hang out, right? And so we need to recognize that. And I think people have to be very careful about not putting expectations on Black women that are unreasonable and that they don't put on other people, on everyone else. And I think those are some ways that we can begin to do that, and to help women to begin to name this thing, and to recognize that when people are living into the image of the strong Black woman and they're living into that myth, that means they're not living into the authentic person that God has created them to be, which is ultimately the problem with the strong Black woman. If I am trying to live up to this image, and all my life I've been molded to live up to this image, that means I don't know who I actually am. I'm living according to a myth as opposed to according to the image of the Imago Dei. I'm not living as though I'm made in the image of God. And so there has to be a lot of unmasking, unearthing for women to begin to figure out who they actually are, and then to learn to be comfortable living fully into who they are, right? So living it and embodying it, displaying it before others, having relationships that are based on who I really am as opposed to who you need me to be. And so that's the kind of work we need to be helping women to do. And that work I think part of it is lifelong, because we have so much of a history of this now, and it's been drilled into us since birth almost.
You know what? And I'm going to say one thing. Dr. Walker-Barnes, she stresses in the book, this is a lifelong journey, but it is worth it. It is worth it. Some of these practices are things I do for myself, but after reading the book, I'm like, I'm even more committed to that. So pastors, if any African-American woman, buy this book and give it to your pastor. If you want to have a better time in your church, start a Bible study group around it. Email Dr. Walker for some suggestions. She has some the 12 steps for the strong Black woman. I see, it's an addict. We are addicts, addict to strength.
Yes.
So the burden of strength. Oh my gosh! If we have time, I would love us to talk about that, but we are running out of time. So people pick up that book. Dr. Walker, thank you so much. I want to just ask a little bit. So I perceive that this is really healthy for our conversation on egalitarianism. Now I will say womanism, since a womanist theories. But I don't even know that people are aware of that inside this book are gender equality issues from the perspective of a woman of color. So, how can you, would you say, I'm sure anybody listening to us right now already figures it out that I need to pick up that book, it will help our conversation. But can you say anything to the people listening, either our white and brothers and sisters or our women of color communities, about the contribution of your work, how it could help with the equality conversation, especially from the point of view of women of color?
Yeah. I mean, I think part of it is my work is motivated by the perspective that none of us are free until all of us are free.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
And so
That's the
there's
truth.
no way that we can, the issue about gender equality is never just about gender.
Yeah.
Right? Because there's so many differences and so many subgroups within gender, right? We race, sexual orientation, gender identity, class, there are all these other issues. And so when we talk about establishing gender equality, if we're not talking about race, then when we're saying gender equality, what we're really talking about is equality between white women and white men, right?
Ooh.
Is white women want their full experience of white privilege, right? They want the same white privilege that white men get, right? And so, and likewise, if we talk about racial equality without talking about gender, what we're really saying is that Black men and white men want to be equal to each other, right? And
Yes.
so we have to go beyond that, and we have to always think about who's not being considered, right? And part of it is that when you live at the intersection of oppression, you have a different view. This oppression thing is huge, right? The way in which the powers and principalities, and that's how I always think of systemic oppression, that this is the powers and principalities that we hear about in Romans, right? These things are big and have been working long before any of us and will be working after all of us, right? And none of us has a full understanding of it, but each of us from our own little segment, our own little area can get a glimpse. And so we need the glimpses of as many people as possible to figure out how this works, but also how these different types of oppression work together. And so, yeah, a lot of what I'm doing in the book is trying to free Black women from this particular element of racialized patriarchy. Right? And so that is really what it's about, is helping women to move beyond that, but also trying to show other people, right? White women, white men, Black men, how their identities are also in bondage to racialized patriarchy, right? That they are also have been locked into some certain views about who to value, who has value, and how you must portray yourself in order to be valued.
That is really important. Okay, I'm going to ask if Ali has a question. Ali, do you have a question for Dr. Walker before we go into our last questions? Let me see. Carol says hello. Yeah, I don't know if they can. Just give me a minute. So Dr. Walker cannot see your comments, so I am just going to read them to her. Marian Peel and I hope I'm saying that right, and Carolyn Smith, they say hello. Yeah. So do you all have any questions for Dr. Walker? Because we are about to wrap up here. And well, if anyone has it, you can type it and I'll come back to that. So Dr. Walker, do you partner with any egalitarian or womanist organizations for women or people of color? And if so, what are some that you would recommend for our audience and communities that want to do better by the strong Black women?
Well, there is a kind of informal network of womenist theologians that are kind of my community, and we have a group in the American Academy of Religion. And so if people are in the academy, they can go to places like that.
Okay.
There are other groups like Baptist Women in Ministry. There are other kind of denominational groups, and within the United Methodist, there's the Commission on the Status and Role of Women, right? So there are these places that are trying to do this work kind of within different denominations. I have, because of the layer of race being added to gender for me, a lot of organizations that are egalitarian, I have kind of the classic womanist dilemma, is that people might be very progressive on issues of gender and very regressive on issues of race, right? And so I have difficulty finding organizations that, race, gender, sexuality, get all of that at least together, right? And so I'm always kind of the odd one woman out, right? So I can either be one of the lone Black women among a group of kind of radical feminists, or one of the lone Christians. So there aren't a lot of formal organizations in as much as I have these pockets of community that I try to be intentional about. One of the organizations I do find a lot of hope within the historically Black church is the Samuel DeWitt Proctor Conference that has been very, very intentional about emphasizing the voices of women. And actually today I was looking at the registration for their conference, and they're asking for your pronoun preference and their gender. They give all these different ranges for gender, and I just, I let out a hallelujah while I was looking at the registration. Yes! And so there are places, but more often than not, those are spaces I only get to be in for a few days a year. And those are not my spaces most of the time. Actually, and this a whole nother subject could be the shock I found from transitioning from clinical psychology to ministry, and the degree to which open gender discrimination was an issue in ministry in ways that I could not even imagine in psychology, right? The things that people could say to me and would do very openly, and that nobody in my secular psychology world would have ever done, right? Not without expecting some serious repercussions, right? And that still tends to be something that I bump my head up against. I also find community in secular feminist organizations, the National Women's Studies Association and their regional groups as well, and some other places where it's nice to be in a place where you know, like, okay, I'm not crazy. And if anything, I realize where I feel really radical over here in my Christian crowd. When I get over here, then I'm like a prude, right? And they're pushing me to go further. And so, that's kind of where I am in that.
And you know, Dr. Walker-Barnes, what you have just described is the dilemma for women of color, especially of African origin. Anybody listening, this is why it's so hard for us to feel at ease, because the general idea of equality still hasn't taken into consideration our experience and our place in society. And so the only way to cross that Rubicon is to learn, be willing to learn. And because I run into this all the time, people in organizations that think they're egalitarian, like, no, your egalitarianism is only, it really doesn't serve me as a Black woman, in so many ways, the white woman profits more from feminism than I do. And so if you want me to profit, you need to consider how my color. So just putting that out there, that for those who wonder what can we do to make our organizations more inclusive, more a place for everybody, you have to tackle the issue of race. I know for many people, they don't want to touch it, but if you don't want to touch it, that means you don't want to touch us.
Yeah.
We're still no part of you. Hey. So my last question for you is, what gift would you love to leave the church and the world? Because Dr. Walker, you are serving both ways. You are bringing healing to the unchurched, as well as the church community. What gift would you like and legacy would you like to leave? So if the Lord called you home today, what do you hope or think he has accomplished through you?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Well, I say that my personal mission is to kind of do my part in dismantling white supremacist heteropatriarchy while practicing good self-care. So that's kind of my personal mission. So
that's a good one.
Yeah.
That's the first time I have heard it put like that, And I love the way you talk about that in the book, where Jesus is talking, you gotta love yourself. And so often that is the part that women are not taught. And this is why women are the highest category for abuse. We're in abusive relationships, we're abused by the church, and they turn around and like, I didn't do anything to you.
Right.
Like, you don't get it. You're constantly asking us not to exist for your benefit, for the benefit of your ideologies. And like you said, we are diminished.
Yeah.
And we're not. So self-care, thanks for putting that in your Trinity.
Yeah. Yeah. So whatever I can do to do my part, where I can be a catalyst for those conversations, those tough conversations. I still have, I have a lot of hope for the church, even though I'm also very angry with the church, right? I'm disgruntled with the church, and I'm in a space, and have been in a space for now over a year and a half, of mourning. What I see is the church's abdication of its responsibility to fight for the marginalized. But I also have hope that the church can be better than it is. And so anything that I can do, at least in my little corner of Christendom, to push the conversations, and to push us to move more deeply into what it means to be beloved community. That's what I hope to do.
Oh, thank you. That is really meaningful. So Caroline and Marion have two comments for you. Caroline says, thank you for this talk, learning so much.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, Caroline is an ally. And then Marion, who's a sister caller, she says, thank you for this discussion. I get so angry with my Black brothers at church who deny me the opportunity to serve God the same way they do. Dr. Walker, what do you want to say to her? Say something. Come on, heal that sister right now.
Yeah. I was recently it's the church where I grew up, and the church that does not, they won't allow women in ministry. Women aren't allowed on the pulpit. And yet they have accepted as a minister a man who has engaged in illegal and immoral behavior for decades now, and that they know about, and that they have known about. And that dichotomy, right, of like, wow, they won't recognize my ordination, but they recognize him. There's something deeply, deeply wrong with this. And so I think there are a lot of us who are angry. We're told that we should not be angry, but silencing women's anger is another tool of patriarchy. So I think it is okay for us to be angry. We have to find ways in which we don't let that eat us alive, right? And hopefully don't give up completely on the church. But I do believe that periods of sabbatical are good. Um, um, and so, yeah, I'm there with you. There are other people there in that same place of just deep frustration, resentment, even. Um, and again, it is so flagrant. There are things that the church can get away with regard to sexism that, again, no other industry could get away with. And
Also,
that
church, know why your setting is so abusive now. This is it, right there. That's why all these stories of abuse are coming out of the
church.
We get the nerve to do things in the name of Jesus and in the Word, and use the Bible. And don't forget, over time, we're talking about this issue of racism even right now, because our white brothers use the Bible hid over our heads to put us in bondage.
Yes.
So we have to, I think there's one problem the church is not owning, that the church often uses the instruments of our faith to oppress the weak.
Yes. Yeah. So I think we have some real reckoning to do within our communities. And I think we have to push our communities to do that, whether we're pushing from the outside or the inside. I think it's important for us to continue to raise our voices and let it be known, and find community in doing that so that you can be sustained as you do it. We may not see a lot of change happen, but I think we can each push us in the right direction, right? Change always comes. I'm reading the work of Polly Murray right now, and who was the first Black woman ordained in the Episcopal Church, and a whole lot of other accomplishments. But it is a reminder that progress is, especially justice, is a relay race. And you don't know, you can only do your part to carry the baton to the next runner. You don't know what's going to work, what's not, when there's going to be a win and what's not. But for us to keep doing our part and keep pushing, that hopefully the church will get there one day.
Thank you, Dr. Walker-Barnes. Marianne, is that helpful? Was that good? Was that helpful for you? Dr. Walker, I just want to talk about this book again. It's the best $25 you could ever spend. Women of color, African American women, you want to get this book because you will be changing your communities. You will be breaking cycles of abuse. You will be boosting your confidence. You will be more open to the spirit, just being spirit-led. You will be breaking free from that bondage, experiencing the freedom of Jesus Christ. And there's so much that Dr. Walker offers here for self-care, even before you get in touch with a psychologist. And she mentioned one of those things over and over in her speech tonight: community. CB Voices of Color, we exist for you, women. Yes, it is a space that we also invite our white brothers and sisters into, but we're doing that deliberately because we need for them to see us. We don't want to hide. We want to see us as we are, and learn to listen when we talk. So I want to encourage you all, please join that community when you can. And Dr. Walker, I just want to say thank you again. I didn't know that there was any way I could restrain myself to an hour, because I love this book. I love it. Thank you so much. Do you have any last words for our communities?
No, just, take care of yourselves. Love yourself, love God, love your neighbor.
Oh, thank
Yeah.
you. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank
And tell your son he has a great mom. I mean, he knows when men cook. I need to come over to your house for dinner. So, yeah, when he's 12, like fix that meal. So, sisters out there who are raising daughters, mark her number because they're raising an egalitarian son. Put in that lobola real quickly. Yeah, Dr. Walker, can I pray for you?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, so I want to invite you all to join us. It our tradition to say thank you to our guests of the month with a prayer, just asking God to bless them. Lord, I do thank you because you said in your word that whoever believes in you, out of their bellies will flow streams of living water. There become that water that quenches the thirst in our souls, in our spirits. And I thank you for the living waters that are poured tonight and continue to pour from your daughter, Dr. Chanequa Walker-Barnes. I thank you, God, for her recognition that you have this well inside of her that she needs to open up and share with the thirsty souls. I ask God that you would replenish her. I ask God that she might equally be watered in every aspect of her life, that you would bless her family, her work, her ministry, and herself. That, Lord, that well would never run dry because you would keep her connected to you. And through you, Lord, she will continue to be fruitful. I pray for all our listeners as we grow into this knowledge of who we are, that we are valuable to you as women and as women of color. Help us to own that without pride, but without any a sense of shame either. Help us to hold our head up high and declare who we are, just as Jesus was able to hold his head high and declare he's the Son of God. Thank you for this good word you have sent to our community today through your daughter, Dr. Chanequa Walker-Barnes. Bless her and bless our community. We pray this in the name of Jesus. Amen.
Amen.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Walker. It has been Walker-Barnes. It has been a pleasure. I am looking forward to meeting you again. I met you in Pittsburgh. Ooh, I didn't know I would meet you face to face one day. That was lovely, and we are really grateful that you took the time to do this for us. I know how busy your schedule is, so thank you. We love you.
Love you too. All right, thank
Alrighty,
you.
God
Bye
bless
bye,
you.
everyone.
Okay, bye.
Bye bye.